I'm Clint Hardy. I'm the extension agent here in Davis County. I work for the University of Kentucky College of Ag. Our office is just actually back here behind this building, so stop in and see us. But the role our office serves the community is basically we're an extension of the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture. We do, I personally, my role in the service is to provide, connect the research-based information that's generated through the university and bring it back to the county level, introduce farmers to it, and help them adopt some of those practices. We also have a family consumer sciences program that teaches home economics and different aspects of the home life, and it's also where the 4-H is housed. But I'm a resident of Davis County, been here all my life, grew up out at Sargo on a small grain farm out there in tobacco.
I'm Jennifer Elwell. I currently have two positions. For the last 17 years, I've been the communications director for the Kentucky Corn Growers and the Kentucky Small Grain Growers Associations. So public relations, education, whether it's non-farmers or school children, and just recently took a role with the Kentucky Agriculture and Environment in the Classroom, being their program coordinator. So get to work more on the classroom side, K through 12, maybe some college, to really bring more of that agriculture knowledge and education to our schools.
My name is Mark Scholl. I live here in Owensboro. I am president of a family company called J&M Scholl Incorporated. We basically have four major things we do in our operation. The first one is we have a 4,000-acre cash grain farm near Bloomington, Illinois, which sits right in the center of the state. On that operation, we grow only value-added products that go to Japan. Everything we do is exported, and principally different types of starch for human and for human consumption, and in the soybean area is also the same. The second thing we do is we also contract grain. We contract mostly on the Mississippi, Illinois, and Ohio rivers. All that grain goes to Toyota, the car company. Toyota happens to be a little known fact is that their largest grain buyer into Japan, and the grains that I talked about we produce on our farm, we're contracting out to farmers all along that river system for export. The third area is I'm a partner in an urban farm. I'm farming with two other people, 62 acres in downtown St. Louis. If you're ever in St. Louis, you come across what they call the new Stan Musial Bridge, and you see the football dome over there. If you look off to the right, you'll see corn and beans and tomatoes and a lot of different things growing. And I have a partner who is well known, probably most of you don't know her name is Jackie Joyner Kersey. She was an Olympian. If you Google her, she was back when dinosaurs roamed the earth compared to you guys, but has a big interest in health and nutrition and all of that. And then lastly, I consult. This next year, I'll be president of a thing called, the chairman of the board of a thing called the Farm Foundation, and that's where we're trying to spread the word about agriculture domestically in the United States.
Well, I think I was going to get started and kind of share kind of the social issues surrounding changes in agriculture. Being a communications director for big corn, or big grain industry, I've always been kind of knee deep in a lot of issues pertaining to perceptions about agriculture. The last few years, it's been more chin deep. A lot of times I want to pull the covers over my head. I think, why do people believe that? Why do they believe what they hear on Dr. Oz and Oprah? How many of you right now are worried about the GMO popcorn that you're eating? Are there any hands? Who says that's a trick question? Well, there's no such thing as GMO popcorn. It's not grown. There is no GMO variety of popcorn, so you don't have to worry about that. So you all are safe right now. But how agriculture has changed socially, if you think about, and this is always how I start the conversations with the little kids when I'm going to the schools and talking to them. How did people eat before we had farms? You hunted, you gathered, and that was it. You didn't have time for Nintendo and Xbox. Of course, I know that's kind of old news now, but you didn't have time for Minecraft or whatever. Your life was, you looked for food, you ate, you looked for shelter and you tried not to get killed. And that was your life. But we move forward in history, we learned how to farm, people could stay in one place, civilizations grew because of agriculture, and things changed dramatically. We were able to specialize in jobs and figure out how to do things, and so much has changed just because of agriculture. Now, last century, everything was great. The Industrial Revolution happened. People could move off the farms. It went from 100% people growing food to now 2%. Last century, as people were moving off the farms, there was still a pretty good percentage of people growing our food, but they had to feed a lot fewer people. More people were moving off the farm, less people growing the food. Now it's less than 2% of our population here in the U.S. is responsible for growing food for us. And we produce a majority of the food in the world because it's a really great industry here in the United States. It's actually one of the few that provides a trade surplus for us. But we trusted, we were happy, we trusted the government, even though back then, they were spraying all kinds of funky stuff and, spraying DDT in all the neighborhoods to control the mosquitoes. But we trusted the government. You're going to keep us safe. We're happy with our food, and, we have that general trust. And I know trust is a really big thing now. Even as I came in, I saw a billboard from a car dealership, and it just said, "I trust them." That says a lot. I know it's my job to want to make you all trust the farmers, but because of social issues and political issues, people started to lose a lot of trust in the government. They started to question things. Now, the 60s and 70s, that was kind of, the revolution. All of a sudden we kind of had social revolution, environmental revolution. People were really starting to think about those things. They kind of started questioning a few things, but in general, we were still pretty happy with our food system and the way things were going. Well, late 80s, Oprah. That was kind of the first big thing that I knew about in my life. Of course, I was young. All of a sudden, she's talking about mad cow. That really devastated the beef industry. She scared a lot of people. Now, mad cow happened in Britain, and people were worried about eating a hamburger here in the United States, worried that it might have some disease and it's going to make them have a disease. And there was so much information that she wasn't sharing, and that kind of started this domino effect of, oh, we're going to get lots of ratings, we're going to cause some, make social change happen. When you give somebody as popular as Oprah, Michael Pollan, or Dr. Oz a microphone, reach a lot of people. Yesterday, in fact, Dr. Oz had a segment about GMO pesticides. Well, one, there's no such thing as a GMO pesticide, but he was talking about pesticide use, and they were getting ready to release a new pesticide, and there was a lot of misinformation. Just the trailer for this segment of the show was all gloom and doom, and you're thinking, oh my gosh, why is the government going to allow this? Talking about everything from breast cancer to it being allowed to be sprayed around school grounds, and being in my community, the agriculture community, all of that has been addressed and debunked even by the EPA. And, sometimes farmers and the EPA don't always agree, but even on this issue, it's like, hey, we review this, it's been well tested. The way that the EPA deals with food safety, they see what causes an effect. It doesn't have to be an ill effect. It can be any kind of effect that a chemical or substance can have on an organism, an animal, or human, and then they take it back 10,000 times and kind of set the limit. So there is a huge difference between what's going to cause an effect, what's an allowable limit. So I have that trust in the government, but when you see Dr. Oz showing somebody, well, since GMOs have been around, or before GMOs were around, they had one person walk out on the stage with a hazmat suit on and a sprayer. Well, this is how much Roundup was sprayed before we had GMOs. Then all of a sudden he has 100 different people join her on the stage. Well, this is how much Roundup's used now. You know, everybody's like, oh my gosh, you know, it's that shock factor. But so many of these platforms are only sharing a part of the information because that's what they really want you to see. He didn't talk about how total number of pesticides had been dramatically reduced. He didn't want to give that visual. He didn't show that the more toxic chemicals had been reduced. He just wanted to show you that one little section of it. So food has become more of a social issue. Had somebody come to Easter dinner. It was, you know, a boyfriend of my sister, and you know, we got in a food conversation, and he wanted to talk about, oh, I don't do anything with those GMOs. And I'm just like, oh, really? I said, he didn't know what I did for a living, so I wanted to know more. He's like, yeah, you know, that company Montessori. He's like, yeah, I don't know anything about that. You know, I don't want anything to do with that. And I'm like, you know, he really doesn't know. It's just kind of hearing a little bit and then sharing that. So, you know, people are sharing a lot of information on Facebook and everything, but it has an effect. McDonald's, Kroger, or, you know, whoever is hearing from people saying, I want change to happen. I want to make sure that food is safe, which I do believe food is significantly or infinitely safer than it was, you know, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, definitely, you know, 1,000 years ago, food is a lot safer. But they want change based on what their perception is safe or environmentally responsible or more ethical. There's a lot of people telling McDonald's that's what they want. McDonald's is worried about losing customers. So then they're going to go tell the farmers, we want you to do this. And the farmers are like, you know, it's going to cost us a heck of a lot more money to grow that. Are you going to pay us more for it? Are you going to raise the prices at your McDonald's? And, you know, if food costs a lot more at McDonald's, are people going to go? So there's a lot of issues there. However, you know, talking with poultry growers, if McDonald's comes to them and says, we want you to produce those chickens in this manner, they can't afford not to do that because that is a huge customer of theirs. So it's interesting, you know, how social issues have changed agriculture over the years. And I know our other experts are really going to get into the technology and economic things. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, you know, thinking about in preparation for this, thinking about how agriculture has changed. It's changed in a lot of ways. Life has changed in a lot of ways. I know a lot of you are younger in age than we are, but we've all seen things occur in our life that have evolved, and that's in education, it's in healthcare, it's in industry, it's in everything about life is constantly changing. So, you know, when agriculture's changed a tremendous amount over the years. Jennifer alluded to how the number of farms have the ability and the production capacity has increased, and it has. You know, you think of just less than 100 years ago, or just over 100 years ago, you know, we were still preparing and planting and harvesting crops with horses. Your grandparents and great-grandparents, their transportation was horses. So you look at how technology really is everything from just the adoption of an automobile or the adoption of a tractor or a cell phone or a computer. Technology is all around us, and so really when you look at how agriculture has changed, it's been technology driven. And we think of technology as electronic devices, but really technology is any new adoption that makes life easier. In agriculture, we've seen the adoption of more modern, more developed farm machinery that beginning in the late 60s, as planting equipment improved, it allowed us the opportunity to be able to use less tillage in preparation of the fields for crops. And that began in the late 60s, and it's evolved all the way to today, that now with the adoption of better herbicide technology, better materials to help chemically control weeds and prepare the soil, the ability now to completely plant a crop with no tillage and have yields that match or are higher in a lot of situations of fields that were tilled. So technology is really kind of the driver of life and change, and it's changed ag. Thinking about the changes I've seen, my family, I'm the 6th generation to be involved in a farm business in Davis County. A lot of your grandparents or great-grandparents were probably associated with farming in Davis County or the surrounding counties. I know 1 or 2 of you are directly involved in farming today. Your families still farm. And so the opportunity, one of efficiency that technology brought, it allowed farms to produce more within the same period of time. So farms have grown larger over the years. But what's really unique, I think, and we talk about it a lot in ag, we talk about the consumers not being aware of where their food comes from often, and sometimes agriculture in agriculture we sometimes feel that we kind of get a bad rap from consumers who may not be completely informed. But what's really unique, I think, just in my life, being a 6th generation, there's been a kind of a disconnect even within the farming community because we've become specialized in what we do. And the example is my great-grandfather grew grain, had hogs, had cattle, had chickens, grew tobacco. So he was very diversified in what he did. The grain he produced was primarily used to feed livestock. Very little sales directly to these people who export and the other developed markets that Mark alluded to. So in my life, my great-grandfather had all those categories. My grandfather, actually before I was born, still got out of the hogs but still had cattle, no chickens, but he grew grain and tobacco. They got out of the cattle. My father grew grain and tobacco. And we still grow grain and tobacco. But even being from a farm background in Davis County, understanding the cattle and the things out milling around the fields, the change in my family and in a lot of families was that our knowledge of the other categories in agriculture became less. And so the example I have now is the first experience I had with beef cattle, being raised on a farm in Davis County. The first opportunity I had to really experience or be involved in beef cattle was when I was in college and required to study animal science for a semester. And so going into extension, you have an expectation to have a knowledge of beef cattle, so I've learned a lot about that. But the other big change is the number of dairies. You know, we always talk about, a lot of people think milk comes from the store. Well, I knew milk came from dairies, but just because a person is a farmer doesn't mean that they've really taken time or had the experience of all the other categories. I was never on a dairy farm until I became an extension agent. There's very few left in Davis County. And so that's been I think kind of an interesting change. Is the dynamic is that people have become specialized. Large grain farms, large dairies, vertical integration, which means the people some farms have really aligned directly with companies that process meats or process tobacco. And so there's been a vertical integration to where a farmer joins basically in a production agreement with a specific entity to produce livestock or a specific farm product for them. So that's been really a change, and we were just discussing it last week on one of our last remaining. We've got 3 dairy farms in Davis County, and the farm there, he had built his daughter, who's in high school, I believe. He'd built her a chicken coop just for the experience of growing chickens the way my great-grandfather did there on the farm, to collect eggs, to collect them for meat. And so I thought that was really interesting from the standpoint that agriculture, these farms have changed a great deal from being something that had a little bit of everything to a whole lot of 1 or 2 things. So that's been a big change. The technologies have obviously the electronic technology that's taken hold of life in general, whether it's you're in your car, in your phone, in your pocket, on your phone, even the home appliances have really become more technical, and we've seen that in agriculture too. The machinery is much more technical, still does the same job. The tractors still pull implements, the combines still separate grain from residue, but they're more electronically technical than they were, and that's been interesting to experience. It's really driven cost up, you know, when production costs have increased because of the things embedded in the research and the technological advancements. Now those companies have to require more for their products that the farmers purchase. And in general, the size of everything has really increased, you know, because these farms have become more individualized in what they do and became larger. Everything, the capacity, the ability of all the machinery now has dramatically increased. A new combine today can probably do what 3 combines could do 30 years ago, and the same size machine. So that's been very interesting to experience. But agriculture's changed, life has changed, and it's fun to be a part of it.
Well, first of all, just a question. How many of you here come from a farm where your grandparents still farm, live on a farm? Just raise your hand. This is interesting. One of the things I find a lot of times when I go to talk to groups, even you think about here, you're kind of in, you know, Owensboro, Kentucky, which is known to be a pretty rural area, you know, in the sense of you've got a lot of farm capabilities, you've got other things that basically make you think of that. And then I don't know what the percentage here was, but I would say maybe 20% of you raised your hand, something like that. One of the things for agriculture today, I think, has been the first great change for me has been, you know, growing up. It seemed like every time I went to something, no matter where I went in the United States, I always met someone who had a grandparent or a parent who came from a farm, or that they could go out, you know, they'd visit or whatever. And today, one of the startling things that you have is that just no one has an understanding or background of it. And I'm not so much even from the understanding of it, just the tie. You know, you hear the jokes about, you know, well, where does milk come from? Well, it comes from, you know, a machine somewhere, or it comes from whatever. When you say a cow, they kind of go, really, you know, a cow? And it's things that, you know, you think that are so basic, but really have changed a lot. And I think that backdrop is one of the areas that's really started to change agriculture as a whole, and it kind of ends up being at the farm gate. So what I'm going to talk to you about is 3 or 4 things that we see today that affected me as a farmer, and that have brought about me either changing because I had to and I wanted to, or things that externally are happening to us to make that change. The first thing today that's different about a farm, and the biggest change is the amount of money and the volatility that it has in it. It used to be that whenever we were selling a crop, the low price, I'll just use corn as an example, and it's pretty much this way with you. If you look at corn, beans, wheat, beef cattle, hogs, chickens, any of them, the volatility on it is so much greater than it used to be. Like when I started out in farming, corn at the beginning of the year started at $2.20, and it went to $2.60, and that was it. And the only thing you did, you farmed for the farm program, and that was, I'm going to produce as damn much corn as I can, because I know I'm not going to get it on the price, so I got to produce. In the last 5 years, corn's gone from $3 to $8. Beans have gone from $5 to $18. The one that blows my mind is beef cattle have gone from $50 a pound, or 50 cents a pound to $2 a pound. Hogs have gone from 30 cents to about $1. And you guys are seeing that. You walk into the grocery store. I imagine there's time you know, living here and going to school, and if you're living on your own, you go in, you get sticker shock, you look at that stuff, you go, mother of God, what is going on here? Well, what's going on is that the volatility, of kind of, you know, where is that coming from? Well, you hear a lot of times, you hear about ethanol. I'm sure you've heard, have any of you heard the food versus fuel debate? Well, you know, there's a lot of people who've talked about that over the last few years, and And the ethanol production was part of it. But the greater thing is some changes that your generation is going to see, and it's going to change the guys who are on the farm and the gals who are on the farm in the future. But you guys are going to see it one way or the other. Whether you go into agriculture or you're in the farm, but you're going to see it at the food case, basically. And one of the larger things that's happening in the world is you hear about this thing of we got to feed 9 billion people by 2050. And today I think there's like 8 billion in the United States. We're going to add 2 billion people by 2050. And we're having trouble feeding the world now. The one that I think doesn't get talked about much, though, is it's not the volume. It's how many people are going to be competing with each and every one of you to buy the food that's out there. Today, there's 300 million people in China, 150 million people in India making more than the average American. You know how many people are in the U.S.? 300 million. So you got almost today double the United States population making more than you guys right now, if you jump forward 15 years, making more than you'd be making then, and they estimate that number will be within 15 years, somewhere in the neighborhood of 700 million people making more than $50,000 a year. Just as importantly, the middle class in the world is defined anyone making over 15,000. Within 5 years, half the world, this is the one that really gets me, half the world will be they'll be above middle class. All of that's causing demand for food. So the one thing is can we produce enough? But the second thing is you got China buys the equivalent. China buys basically the whole U.S. soybean crop each year. And they're not done. They're doubling pork production, they're doubling chicken production, they're doubling all of that at a geometric rate. Now, you've got that problem, you're going to think about the storefront, but when you sit there as a farmer and you start out the year and you got, the weather factor, you're sitting there every year and you're going, is it going to rain or is it not going to rain? Is it going to get too hot or is it not going to get too hot? And you're sitting there and you got prices going like this. I don't know if there's any banker sitting in here, but the banker tends to look at you like, I hope like hell you know what you're doing when you go to sell this crop, because if you don't, you won't be doing it very long. Volatility is the thing, and the amount of money it's taking is changing all of what we're doing. And sometimes you have an avenue you can go bigger, or you can try to figure out how to make something differently. So volatility and the amount of money is the first one. How do we handle that? What we're starting to look at is can we grow other crops? Can we do other things to add value at the farm? One of them is what we're really starting to look at, and one thing that's helped us a lot is this whole issue of GMOs. You hear the GMO thing and you hear the technology. Well, the greatest change I've had in the last 5 years, probably one of the great changes I've had on the farm in the last 5 to 10 years has been variable rate technology, GPS, all of that. You guys hear about all this, but basically what it is its capability for some satellite to beam down to my planter and tell me plant every inch, bink, 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 or vary it. Now what's that got to do with anything? Well, if I can start to vary how much fertilizer, how much chemical I can use, or what seeds I can use, that helps me be more effective in what I'm producing. To go to something that Jennifer, she just said a minute ago about the use of chemicals. When you look at our farm, I'm using about 40% less chemicals than I did 10 years ago. One that really gets a lot of people that relates to environment is, I now, on about 30% of my acres every year, I don't put any nitrogen on in the summer. Now what's that got to do? Well, that helps me on the expense side. One, be more efficient. Two is get better production, and also be a better environmental steward. The whole area of this, people, whether they know or they don't know, outside influences on what I do is one of the third biggest changes I get. And how does that manifest? I'll give you an example. This last 2 weeks ago, the EPA, I think it was, or 3 weeks ago, put out a thing that said, it seems simple as could be, well, we're going to start saying that the waterways of the United States are anything that feeds a river. Sort of. Now, what's that mean? That means if you have a puddle in your yard and it drains off the Ohio River, that's part of the U.S. waterways, and they're going to tell you what to do with your puddle. Now, what's that got to do with farming, and what's that got to do with what we do? Well, it starts to say that the government, and the government being a part of what we produce, is the third greatest change. I've had the government in farm programs, but the government now is telling us, starting to talk to us about how much fertilizer we put on, how much chemicals we put on, how much water we put on. Any of you read about Northern California? You know what's going on there? Drought. There's a big thing called the Ogallala Aquifer going through Nebraska and up in there. It's not putting water out anymore, it's shooting mud out. But what they're starting to say is, I'm going to tell you how much water you can put on, or I'm going to tell you how much water you can use, or I'm going to tell you how you're going to take and till your land so that we make certain the water doesn't run off. I'm not draconian, as they call it, or worried about the government. What I want to say is that the third thing that's really changed is the things that I have to think about as it relates to, and I'm not saying all this is bad, but I'm saying the amount of kind of record keeping, paperwork, and everything else to farm today is much, much different than it was even 10 years ago, or for sure 20 years ago. And so another change is that we have to be a lot more astute on how we keep track of stuff. When my dad was growing up, he used to carry in his pocket, they called them seed corn books, a little book about this wide, about that long. He'd stuck it in there, and everything he did on the farm was written on that seed corn book, and that was his Bible, and if he lost it, he was probably, lost. Well, today, needless to say, you can't use the seed corn book. And this third area that I'm talking about, where we've really changed, is the records, the accountability, understanding where we're at, being good stewards and stuff, and being able to report it to someone is much, much, much different than we used to have. Next one is understanding, if you're going to put those products on, do you understand what the consequences of them are and what they do? And so consequently, I have to be a lot more in tune with what am I putting on there and what happens if I do it. I.e., there was a story, I don't know if how many of you there was a post, the Vietnam War, there was a story about a thing called Agent Orange. I don't know if any of you ever heard of Agent Orange. And Agent Orange was, thought to be the major killer of people coming out of Vietnam with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And Agent Orange was a thing called 2,4-DB. 2,4-D was a chemical we used on the farms a lot. And my dad he passed away at about 43 years of age, and he used to spray 2,4-D a lot. And one of the changes that I think is good, and that we in the farming community have to be a lot more astute on, it was alluded to a little bit ago about some of the things we used to use, is what are we using? Do we have a better understanding of them? And do we have the idea of what the consequences are? That whole area of what you're doing with how you do it is a big changing area in farming. 5, it takes a lot different person to take and farm than it used to. You get in some of these tractors, combines, et cetera, today, and it looks like you're getting in the space shuttle. I don't know if any of you have ever had the opportunity to be in one, but you get panels of computer stuff and gadgets, you got to take and work with, and you got to set this, and you got to do that. I don't want this to sound wrong, but we used to just kind of, if a guy retired, we'd get him to help us on the farm. One of the biggest changes I have today, and this is one of the hardest things I have today, is finding good, talented people who can understand that, run that, and want to do the kind of work we do. I mean, if you're thinking about being in an office in air conditioning and being out on a farm in the summer when it's 104, you got a pretty good idea what probably a lot of people your age want to do. They probably like to be somewhere else than out in the 104-degree weather. So the educational level and everything that we have to look at today and the type of people that we have to have, we're getting more to where a big thing is finding people, recruiting them, and being able to retain them. Because a lot what we do, I'm sad to say, a lot of the young people we brought back to the farm to work with kind of use it as, I learned this, I got this skill, I have this technical capability now, and then they move on to another job, and it's harder. to deal with from the labor standpoint or the manpower standpoint. Lastly, I think the biggest change for the farm and the farming industry is that they both alluded to this. When I was growing up, farming was kind of, you've heard the term motherhood apple pie in the American way, you know, the old Chevy thing and all that. And the farmer was pretty highly thought of. There was just a poll, a survey run by a pretty reputable independent firm who they asked two questions. Do you have a positive understanding or feeling toward agriculture? And do you have a positive understanding or feeling towards farmers? And it was a high percent said they had a very high opinion of farmers. They had a very low opinion of agriculture. And a lot of that's coming out of, you know, the perception of the guy out there working on the farm is still pretty good, but the perception of the industry is, what are they doing? They really shoot square with us? And that's a big deal, from the farm gate to the plate. Because if we don't have that trust, and we don't continue to merit that trust, the changes that I've seen over the past 10 to 15 years, I think, will be minuscule as to what you'll see in the next 15 to 20. So, in a nutshell, looking at it from a farmer's perspective, trying to kind of look out, you know, what we see with what's happening globally and stuff, those are the changes that affected me.
I think we wanted to open it up for questions. Of course, if I don't see any hands, I'm going to have to come up with something else to say.
Please.
Could one of you, just in a nutshell, talk about GMO, genetically modified, what that means and what the debate is about, or what the controversy is about?
Well, I mean, sometimes I like this argument, sometimes I don't. If you think about how the genetics of crops have changed over the ages, I need to back up. I mean, we've been manipulating genetics since agriculture, well, you know, since we started feeding ourselves. You know, what was once considered a corn plant 7,000 years ago that grew wild is remarkably, significantly different than what a corn plant looks like today, and that's just through, you know, traditional breeding methods. Say, oh, the kernels on this corn plant look a lot better, they're bigger, so I'm going to save those seeds and just plant those, and, you know, things changed over time. Tomato, I mean, it came from a toxic primrose plant. So over time, you know, we were able to alter, you know, foods so we could, you know, eat them and enjoy them. But when it comes to what we term a GMO today, it's where they have taken genes, you know, 1 out of billions or trillions that an organism has, that has a positive characteristic. They may have taken that from another organism, which could be a bacteria or whatever, and inserted that into the corn plant or the soybean plant or the cotton plant to have the desired effect. With traditional breeding, it could take years and years and years to get the traits that are desired. This really shortens that time frame. They can also turn genes around or turn one off, so it's not always, you know, them taking something from a completely different organism and inserting to a new gene. You know, there's lots of different ways that they can manipulate those genes. I've heard many people say that they actually feel that that's a safer method because they can reduce the non-desired traits from that genetic manipulation. You know, even in the 50s, and this is, nobody has ever talked about this being like, oh gosh, you know, genetic radiation. They wanted to mutate the genes to see what kind of effect they got, and if they got something positive, well, we're going to plant those seeds. So we've been doing a lot of things for a lot of years, but when it comes to what is called the GMO, I think a lot of it is more tied to people's idea of the company, a lot of the fears. You know, when seeds are produced or plants are produced that can resist herbicides being applied to them, you know, in the mind, it's like, oh, well, that company has produced that so they can sell more herbicide. So that's a win for them. Well, how does that affect me? Does that mean that it's now unsafe for me to consume that product? Well, throughout time, no other crops have been tested like the genetically modified crops have. You know, in the past, beginning of time, you see a nut or a berry sitting there. It's like, hey, try this, see if it kills you or not. You know, and then, you know, we knew if it was safe or not. But, and even, you know, hybrid technology for corn, I mean, adding things together, as far as genetics go from different plants, those weren't tested to say, you know, is this long-term, is this safe? You know, that was never tested like that. We just generally know that, you know, it's going to be okay. But the genetically modified crops have actually been tested for, you know, sometimes 20 years. So I feel confident in their safety. I don't know if that answered specifically.
Just a couple add-ons to that. The GMO issue came about largely because of the chemical use. People were getting concerned about the amount of chemical that was being used at any point in time. And the irony of Roundup, actually, you've all heard about Roundup Ready or Roundup and Monsanto and all that. The irony of Roundup is it's probably one of the most benign, safer chemicals you can use. I mean, it's got a real short, what they call half-life, so you put it out there, it's gone pretty quickly. So the genesis of it was out of less chemical use, so that we wouldn't have to be, you know, we could spray it once instead of having to go back, because it had a broad spectrum, it could kill a lot of different weeds. You hit it once, and then you'd have to go back 6 times with 6 different products. So that was one. The second thing is, you know, this whole thing of, I think a lot of the non-GMO thing has moved to, it appears, what is a right-to-know issue. You know, people, I think we're all got more cognizant about food safety and where we're at, and I think a lot of people want to know, you know, and there's an ongoing debate of how you do that. But I think that lays behind it in a lot of ways. You know, it's, okay, I want to decide whether that's this or not. And so it seems like a lot of the discussion around that. As far as the products themselves, you right now, I think it's pretty close. It takes as long for a genetically modified plant to get to market. The testing it goes through is the same as a human drug. So when you think about it, what you're doing with that is, and it's partially by the differing ways that you make those products and then how you test them. They go through a pretty extensive testing program, as she said, that, you know, looks at a lot of different areas. The FDA, the EPA, the USDA, international bodies look at it to get approval to go out in the marketplace. So from the standpoint of, you know, what's there now, is there something you could miss? Well, there's always something you could miss. But with Mendelian genetics, you know, over the years, we've been crossing and making new products that, you know, for all we know, you know, they could have had allergenicity problems or other things, but we really didn't have the method or mode to test it. The last thing is, one thing that I was doing some business in Europe, and one of the things I found really interesting, a lot of the anti-GMO stuff, for the, you know, if any of you followed it at all over time, it started in Europe. Still to this day, it's a pretty highly European-born thing. And one thing that underpinned that, you got to kind of keep in mind, is the Europeans, because of history, had decided they did not want to go to large agriculture. They wanted to keep their agriculture small. And the reason they wanted to keep it small, if any of you have looked at a map or been to Europe, you know, if you read history, a lot of people came across borders and took over land and killed the men and took over the farm ground and started, you know, take over their food supply. And so having it in less, and not in having it in more hands and controlled by each country is a big deal. GMOs, when you looked at it, started to bring about a thing of larger farms and a way of doing business that was much different than we in the United States, who we were going the other way. We were getting bigger and bigger, and we wanted fields clean, fast, and everything else. And that, to this day, I mean, the European Union has not changed in any way. They still are anti-GMO. A lot of it is a cultural thing. And I don't think that's going to change real quickly, and the discussion's not going to change real quickly. So that's not really based in whether it's better for you. That's based in kind of a way you want to live life and, you know, a political thing.
What's your perspective on how genetic modification or different technologies have helped on the farm side,
Well,
operation level?
At operation level, they've helped tremendously. An example, Roundup Ready is a herbicide trait that these crops have that allows, as he said, to spray a broad spectrum application of a herbicide. The neat thing, I think probably the neatest one, has been the BT corn. Yeah. And BT basically is a Latin, it's initials for a Latin word, Latin name Bacillus thuringiensis. And that is an enzyme, well, it's a bacteria in the soil, naturally in the soil, that they identified when larva insects, not winged insects, not all the different types of insects that there are, but only larva insects, that bacteria is toxic to larva insects. It disrupts their digestion system. And we've got a problem in North America or in other areas of countries of the world also called the corn borer. And a corn borer is a larva insect. It flies in and it feeds on a corn plant and tunnels the stalk out and predisposes it to falling over before it can be harvested. It reduces yield, as well as corn rootworm. We don't have corn rootworm primarily as far south, but up north it's a big problem. These larva insects feed on corn roots and disrupt the root development, disrupt the plant's capability, and go back to the population that we're trying to feed in the next 50 years. We really need to continue to advance our production capability. So this BT product, they identified this bacteria. They took that bacteria, genetically inserted it into a corn plant. Now these farms plant these BT corn acres, and when these corn rootworm moths or corn borer moths fly into these fields and lay eggs, and those larvae hatch, they feed on the corn plant and die. And the neat thing about that is farmers were spraying and spraying and spraying and spraying for these insects prior to this technology and killing all the other insects, beneficials as well, when they did that practice because they had to control the corn rootworm and corn borer. Well, now the plant has a natural defense mechanism against those larvae, specific larva insects, leaving all the other insects alone, leaving the honeybees alone, leaving all the beneficials alone. And so that trait in itself, it's immeasurable, the impact that it's had. So.
Do the corn borers has there been any danger of them becoming resistant to the BT?
There's always a risk, you know, natural selection, the risk of corn or of an insect or a weed developing a resistance to Roundup, or an insect, corn borer, developing a resistance to that BT. Basically, and it's part of the government influence, but the EPA was very cautious about releasing this technology. It was researched and researched and researched, and they developed guidelines, and farmers sign technology use agreements that when we plant this primarily BT corn acres, we either purchase a seed corn that has non-BT corn embedded in the seed bag already. It's called refuge in a bag. Or we plant, and primarily now it's all refuge in a bag, but at the early adoption of this in the late 90s, people would plant 20% of their acres as non-BT corn. And so 20% of your acres did not have that BT gene in them. They were allowed to go ahead and spray those as they did before, but that resulted in an 80, you know, theoretically an 80% reduction in insecticide use otherwise. And
they also, one of the things that all of those companies have done, the BT gene, there's a whole, what you call library of them, and they're kind of like cousins to it. So what they've done is if they're releasing, say, a CRW, a corn rootworm gene with using BT here, the next generation is different, and the next generation is different. So what you're doing is because it will happen. There will be resistance. There'll be resistance. It'll happen in the weeds, and it happens in the bugs.
And it has been a problem, right? I mean,
It is, yeah, it's a concern. It's a problem. I mean, in the sense, like right now, Roundup, there's no doubt that there's a resistance building, and we've had to look at how we manage that. But again, the overall, the usage of chemicals
right, I understand.
has diminished, and so, and is this the efficacy? I mean, the carbon footprint question. I mean, used to be you would go out and we'd tear up the soil, we'd field cultivate it, we might put chemicals on, field cultivate it again, plant it, cultivate it, harvest it, plow it. I don't know how many trips that was, 6 or 7 or something. Well, and you know, from the environmental, depending on where you're at on the global warming or whatever, but that's a lot of emissions.
Yeah, it's just a lot of gas.
So you know, now it is pretty close to spray it, plant it, harvest it. And that's better, you know, it's just so many things. Trips across the field. I mean, compaction, soil, water runoff. I mean, there's things that we can do that it's kind of unleashed us to be able to do that we couldn't do with the old systems and methods we were working with.
And I guess thinking about the GMO, and we need to discuss a little bit about organic. You know, they kind of go not hand in hand. Non-GMO and organic are different. The organic is getting a lot of popularity, and there are rules in place that discuss for the producer how those organic crops should be grown. And what's unfortunate, I think, about organic is that our government, and it's a good government, we live in the best country in the world, they spend a lot of time and money discussing and researching, either through Extension Service, through the EPA, through the land-grant universities, through the USDA. They've spent a lot of time and spent a lot of money researching and identifying the best management practices, ensuring that these crop protectant materials that are available are used in manners that are safe for the environment, are safe for the handlers, are safe for the consumers. What's kind of unfortunate about the organic is it kind of takes us 2 steps back in that it goes back to the multiple passes across the field. It goes back to more challenging production practices as far as controlling the weeds, controlling the insects. It ultimately reduces yield or has a lower yield potential, which naturally, if the supply is lower, that increases the price they have to demand for it. So the organic, in the end, it's unlikely that it's any better for the environment than the newer, more technological farming practices.
What about health-wise? I mean, what about the healthiness of the product?
It goes back to all the research and the efforts have been put in place to make sure that Roundup is safe to spray across a field of Roundup Ready corn. And so the health practices, the health concerns have really not been proven. It really is a popularity thing for consumers. It's kind of it's a fad. It may be here for a long time, but ultimately, Jennifer and I were in South Africa in January, and we asked a consultant we met over there about the opinion of organics and the opinion of GMO crops of the sub-Saharan African continent. He said people have no concerns about those issues when they're hungry. And, you know, American consumers, Mark mentioned about the price of food going up. We've been spoiled. And it's a good spoiled. I mean, I'm a consumer myself. Farmers are consumers, but we've got the cheapest food at the grocery in the world. I don't know the percentage, the statistic.
It's like 10%.
But I don't doubt that our food costs are probably half of what they would be in Europe.
Oh, yeah.
So, you know, the technology ultimately benefits the consumers to hold, you know, everybody only makes so much money, and people, you know, have got responsibilities to, you know, take care of their family, to feed their family. And so probably the way that agriculture has changed the most, to kind of summarize the discussion, is that the technology and the advancements that have been made in American agriculture have ultimately taken consumer food spending from here to here. And that's good for all of us, everyone. And that's pretty remarkable.
I know one of the things that, in talking about changes in agriculture, is about the evolution of the technology. You know, we're talking about organic and GMO and, you know, no-till and all those things that we're doing, but I think we're learning from each other, and we're not finished. We can still improve upon what we're doing. If we're seeing resistance issues, we're going to address that. What can we do differently? You know, Clint and I are in that Kentucky Agriculture Leadership Program, and we have been exposed to so many wonderful opportunities. We even had the pleasure to go to an organic grain farm up in New York, and I think a lot of us kind of went in thinking, oh, you know, what are we going to hear from this person, you know, this farmer, kind of trying to already had this notion of what he was going to say to us, but we could have spent all day there. You know, he had a wonderful knowledge of the soil and what rotation of crops worked the best. You know, he would plant clover and, you know, till it into the soil. So there was a tremendous amount of knowledge there, and a lot of the grain farmers, it's like they wanted to know more. So I think as we are evolving, we want to continue on this path of being able to produce more food with a lot less resources. You know, how can we learn from each other to make it even better? Because I personally, I hate this kind of pitting against, well, conventional agriculture does this and organic agriculture does that. You know, the lines are so blurred these days. It's like, I don't know that it means a lot of anything. You know, you need to actually go and talk to a farmer and say, you know, what are you doing on your farm that makes this better than what you were doing last year? And I think if they're still in business, they're putting things in place to make it better environmentally, you know, producing more food. And back to the, you know, feeding the population issue, what's scary is that when we have all of these kind of surveys, you know, do you trust the farmer? What's your opinion of, you know, commercial ag or small scale farmers? Most people say they don't care that they don't care about feeding the growing world population. That is not their concern. What they want to know is that are the farmers here in America going to be able to provide me and my family a safe, affordable food product? You know, we don't care about people in Africa. We don't care about people in China. We're just concerned about the food we have here. But it's technology that's going to be able to make things better. And I love, and you know, I don't know a whole lot about what goes on in South America, but here in the U.S., we're not tilling up more ground to produce more corn because we think we're going to get $8 a bushel for it. And however, the price of corn today was $3.25. So that volatility has gone way back down, and a lot of farmers
It's
are like,
volatile the other way.
yeah, they're like, am I going to be able to pay for this crop this year? You know, pay for what I've put in the ground. So there's, you know, many issues, and you know, I think we're addressing it because of change and technology.
I go to Owensboro Community and Technical College
because it's so close.
I go
for the small class sizes.
I go because I can transfer my credits. I go because
I can take classes when it works for me.
I go to get a better job.
I go for some of Kentucky's most affordable tuition.
I go because it's crazy not to.
For all the right reasons, Owensboro Community and Technical College. Higher education begins here.